For the purpose of this webinar today, I'm going to be working in Lightroom. I have a catalog of images all set up that I like to use for webinars, and so I'm going to end up going through Lightroom just because it's where most of my images are located. But pretty much all the things that we're going to be doing today, you can do no matter what program you start out in. If you use the Photo Suite as a standalone, if you use Lightroom, Aperture, Photoshop, or Photoshop Elements. So don't feel like the fact that I'm in Lightroom right now is going to change the workflow that we're doing today. No matter what application you're in, the two programs we're going to be using primarily are Perfect Black and White and Perfect Effects. So it doesn't really matter where you start. Each program will work the same no matter what application you like to use. Now, the first thing that I want to talk to you about is a little bit on why we recreate film looks. And I promise it'll be very short. I started out as a film photographer, and I took my first darkroom class when I was pretty young and in high school, and my father gave me my first film camera. I absolutely love film, and I've been shooting it and still do for quite a long time at this point. And film has a very special quality to it that's hard to reproduce these days. We're getting better and better about finding different ways that we can recreate old school film style looks. And there are a lot of great ways to do it inside the suite, but one of the reasons why we do this is because film had that beautiful, stunning quality to it that for so long was very hard to duplicate unless you were shooting film. There are tons of different types of film. It ranges all the way back to the early 1900s and even before then, when people used to shoot things like tintypes. There's a process called wet plate collodion that requires you to actually use things like a silver-based emulsion that you coat over metal or glass, and you end up using chemicals like ether to produce your final result. It ranges all the way up towards the 1970s and 1980s when people were using really fast, really quick 35 millimeter cameras to shoot family photos, and film went from something that was a very privileged access in the late 1800s, where only people who were very wealthy could afford it, to the point when we hit the 70s and 80s, where everybody had a film camera and everybody was shooting all the time. And nowadays, everybody knows what that's like because there are millions of people on this planet, and I would probably say that a very large portion of them have cameras, whether it be the phones in their hand or the digital ones that they're carrying around. But film still has a little bit of an allure, and so there are lots of really fun ways that we can go do that. And I've separated this down so that I can show you some of the really cool old school techniques you can recreate in Perfect Black and White, and then some of the newer techniques that came when color photography was introduced in the mid-1900s. So let's go ahead and jump in. Hopefully you don't mind the nerdiness, because I love talking about film. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to take this image into Perfect Black and White. One of the things that you'll notice is I have cropped it into a square. We shoot today on most digital cameras in a very long format. So this image is, now I did shoot this horizontal, but you'll see it is a very long image. It is, most cameras shoot around a 16:9 ratio. Film, even in the later days, in the 70s and the 80s and so on, didn't have this same 16:9 format. So it wasn't quite as stretched out as we see it today. Back then, people were shooting square format, or they were shooting something called 4:5. That's where sizes like 4:5 inches, 8:10 inches, 16:20 inches, we see those paper sizes all the time. Those are based off of old film sizes, and that's one of the reasons why those papers still exist. So this is what most digital cameras will shoot these days, and what most film cameras shot. I'm just going to show you a quick crop here inside of Lightroom really quick. So this is what a photo looks like out of a digital camera. This is what it looks like when you crop it down to more of a 4:5 inch film style ratio. So you'll see that we're cutting down quite a bit on the left and the right hand sides. That's one of the best ways to recreate a film look when you start out with your images, is crop them down into a square or into that 4:5 inch format, so that you're cutting off that longer edge so it doesn't look quite as long and stretched out, and it will evoke more of that feel of old film. So I cropped this image down into a square so that I could do that. And we're going to go into perfect black and white. The other thing that I'll mention before we jump into perfect black and white is I always recommend creating a copy. If you're working on your original image, you don't want to destroy it by creating something that maybe you end up not liking, or maybe you're creating a film look for a client and you want to make sure that you can go back to your original if you don't end up liking your final product. Or if something goes wrong and you realize, you want to go back and redo something, again, if you don't have an original, it's not so good. So it doesn't matter what program you're working in, you always want to edit a copy of your original file. And if you're working on raw files, one of the best things is you actually don't have to worry much about creating a duplicate because it will automatically create a copy for you inside of the photo suite itself. We don't overwrite raw files, so if you shoot raw, you'll always be able to go back to that original. All right, we'll go ahead and click edit, and we're going to pop it in there. Now, inside perfect black and white, on the left-hand side of the screen, there we go, there are a whole bunch of onOne presets. This is the best place to start out here inside black and white is the onOne presets category. These are pre-packaged adjustments that you can make on your images. And we separate most of these down into the century that they're based off of. Now, what's really great about that is 19th century processes is one of the best places to go to get old school film looks. And when I talk old school, I'm talking things like ambrotypes, glass negatives. There was something called a calotype glass negative. It's very difficult to reproduce nowadays, but you've got this absolutely beautiful, soft, hazy look on the photo. It's one of my favorite things to add to an old image. We have a couple of things called carbon prints and cyanotypes, which if you ever took darkroom photography, you'll probably recognize some of these. But this 19th century processes category is the best place to go if you really want that gritty, old school, early part of the century, like evoking things like a lot of images that came out of the First World War around the 1920s and the 1930s. This is the category for you. Now, there are a couple in here that maybe you'll like more or less, but it's totally up to you. One of the cleanest that you're going to find here is called platinum. Platinum used to be a style of printing, and I'm going to click to apply this here. It's a very soft, very subtle style of images. There isn't much on here except for a very simple toner, a couple of basic adjustments to give it some contrast, and a border. And the toner that's applied is just a very soft, very subtle yellowish toner. And when you used to do platinum printing, a lot of times you would print on a warm paper to kind of pull out some of the yellows and oranges in the highlights of the image. So this is one of the cleanest that you're going to find. And the base for the platinum style is a really great addition to any image. If you don't like the border, one of the great things about applying a preset here inside Perfect Black and White is that you can turn on and off anything. So you'll see everything on the right-hand side is separated down into panes. There's the tone section. You can add glow or film grain. You'll see the toner pane has been turned on because there's a soft, subtle toner that's been applied, and so on. So if there's anything you don't like, just open that category up. So we opened up the border pane here, and I can just turn it off. Now I get that same style of that platinum look for the image, that nice contrast, those softer midtones and highlights, without adding a border that maybe I don't necessarily want. The other thing is you can add options in here. So this image doesn't have a vignette, and that's also something that is a very good way to evoke a film style look. Vignetting was actually something that people used to counteract in the days of film photography. And it was partially because a lot of people had lenses and cameras that didn't fit properly together. Things are a little bit different back then when it came to how lenses and camera bodies fit. And vignettes happened when those two items didn't fit together very well, and you would create this weird vignetting that happened around the edges of the photos. And so there were a lot of ways to counteract that in the darkroom. But nowadays, we actually add them in to give it more of that imperfect film look. So I almost always like to end up adding a vignette. My suggestion is, And this is something that I've kind of worked on while adding vignettes. It's something that I really like to do. In the vignette pane, take the brightness slider and move it down really far, like really far. I usually drop it all the way down to -100. Then I like to take the feathering slider and drop that to 0. The great thing about this is that now I'm getting a visual representation of which part of my photos are going to be darkened. I really don't like to try and guess where my vignette is and kind of look around. I really like to be very specific. So if I know that I'm looking for a vignette that's more of a circle, or if I'm looking for something that's more of a rounded rectangle, as I move the roundness slider over to the left and the right, instead of playing around while that feathering is really high and I can't quite see the difference very well, by dropping the feathering down, I can see it a little bit better. So we're going to go with more of a rounded rectangle there, and then just adjust the size to kind of figure out where we want it to be. And I'll up the feathering amount, and then I'll play around with the brightness. So you can either add a light vignette or a dark vignette. And then the last thing here that's important to remember is that there's something called the style drop-down menu. The normal option is just a solid black overlay that feathers out around the edge. The subtle option blends that overlay into the underlying image and creates a more subtle vignette. And this is the one that I almost always use, whether I'm doing film style looks or not. It's just a little bit cleaner and a little bit nicer. So that tends to be the option that I use. And it doesn't get quite as dark as the normal option, but I tend to like that a little bit more. All right. Now, if you are interested, this is a very simple toner. All it is there's a little bit of a warm tone that's been applied to the highlights of the image, but the toner pane is really, really, really fun. You can create your own toners here, whether one has been added to your image or not. You can turn the pane on if it hasn't. Underneath the preset drop-down menu here, right now it's set to custom. This is a customized platinum-based toner. So if I open this up, we'll be able to see that there are a whole bunch of options in this list here. And we have everything from some of the looks that I was talking about earlier, like ambrotypes, but we also have ways of staining your image. Sepia tone is a really toxic chemical, and so people found other ways to tone their images to create that soft brown look. And two of the most popular options were black tea and coffee. If you stained your final prints with coffee, you could get this really beautiful reddish look. And then if you stained your images with black tea, you got more of a brownish, orangish look. So we have all of these different color types that you can add to your image if the custom one doesn't really work. So let's go up and I'm going to choose one of the black tea options. You'll see when I hover my mouse over the options, I can see an example of what it's going to look like. So this is a good way to scroll around and kind of figure out which one you really like. So we have cyanotypes there. We have something called iron blue. It was a chemical that you could use that was based off of an iron oxide, and it created this really cool teal look on your images. And then one of the most popular is something called selenium. This was a soft purple-based toner that you used on the silver when you processed your images. And selenium is what Ansel Adams used to use for a lot of his photos. So you'll see selenium toners used quite often when people are doing, big, grand, epic landscapes. And then we have our classic sepia tone down at the bottom. Now I'm going to go up and I'm going to choose coffee here because I really like the way that that looks. I'm going to choose the second strength because I like it to be pretty intense. We'll go ahead and let go. Now, just in case for some reason you can't find a toner that you really love, you can always jump in and create your own by clicking in either of the swatches for the highlight color or the shadow color. So we'll click in and let's open up the highlight color really quick. It'll pop open the Select Color dialog box, and this is where you choose a new color to apply to your highlights or your shadows. So this is the highlight color. You'll see it's a very soft, subtle brown. It's more of an orangey brown than a reddish brown, so you can play around, and let's say we want the color to be more saturated. we could change that there. Maybe we want the color to be a little bit brighter. We'll move that over to the right. We can also change the hue. So if we don't really like the orange, maybe we want it to be a little bit more red. Maybe we want to change it all together and create something that's a little bit more of an interesting split tone here. So we'll have a blue for the highlights and a red for the shadows. It's kind of a little bit different. So you can go through and you can choose which one of these you're interested in playing around with. You don't have to choose a new color if you like your toner, you're good to go. But I always like to point this out because you can create some really fun stuff just by changing the color of what's going to be placed on the highlights and the shadows. We'll go ahead and click OK. Now, the last thing in here, right in the middle, is going to be your balance slider. The highlight color and shadow color are set. The amount is just the intensity of that color on your image, but the balance slider is really cool. This adjusts how heavy the highlight color is or the shadow color is and balances them out accordingly. So if I move this over to the left, the image will get darker because the shadow color becomes more prominent. So the image will just get darker. By moving the balance slider over to the right, the highlight color becomes more prominent and the image gets lighter. This is a good way to lighten and darken your image, especially when you're working with a toner. So I'm going to move this over to the right because I want my image to remain a little bit brighter. We don't want to go too dark because that's a little too intense for me. All right, now once we've got our customized toner here that we've gone through and we've changed things like balance, the amount of the highlight and shadow colors and so on, one of the last things, so we've talked a little bit about vignettes, we've talked about toners, we've kind of gone through and we've talked about some of the basics of these old school 19th century processes looks. One of the most important things about working with black and white and making it look a little bit more like film, so I want to open up the color response pane. Back in the days of film, when you used to shoot black and white, you were given, most of the time when you got a lens, you were given the option of buying filters with them. Now, it seems a little strange when you think about it. Why would you give someone a colored-based filter when you're shooting black and white? What does it do? Well, the color filters that you used to place on your lens when you shot black and white film would take information from the outside world, which is color-based, and it would adjust the tones of how light or dark a specific color would be. And each filter that you would apply, and there were lots of different colors you could add, things like red, yellow, orange, all those basics, as well as infrared-based filters, which created some really funky looks. They were all different on how they adjusted the tones of each color. Red is one of the most popular filters to use. It creates very high contrast looks because it lightens warmer tones like reds and yellows and darkens cooler tones like aquas and blues. Now, the reason why I like to mention this is because one of the coolest things that you can do to a black and white image is change how the filter looks. Right now, it's set to something called auto mix, and it just kind of goes through, looks at your image, it pays attention to all of the original color information, which is still there underneath our black and white image, and it kind of tries to auto-adjust it according to the photo itself. But by clicking one of these different filter presets, for instance, the red filter, it will go through and it will change how the image looks. So this is what the photo looks like with the red filter. You'll see that all of those tones in the oranges and yellows and reds, so like the face right here, the leaves on the yard behind the subject, some of the leaves that are in the trees, those will all get lighter. This is what we started with originally. A lot of those tones were a little dark, and with the red filter, they get a little bit brighter. So if you hover your mouse over any of these, they'll tell you kind of what it does. My suggestion is just click and find one that you think looks best. Infrared is going to be one of the weirdest. It darkens everything except for the yellows and the greens, and that can create some kind of surreal, strange looks. I tend to use red almost all the time. So You can manually adjust these if you want to, so you can darken and lighten each one of these separately, but I always like to play around with the filter presets if I want to get more of an authentic film look. All right, so we'll go ahead and close that out. Now, when you're creating kind of a style for your image, one of the things that I recommend is that if you are adding borders, to wait and do it in another program. Perfect Black and White can apply borders. As you saw when we first added, it may be a little strange because we've changed so much about this image, but we actually started with the, where'd it go? The platinum print right here. And this was the preset that we started out with, but we created something that's a little bit more faded. It looks like it's been toned with coffee or tea. So it's very, very different. The borders pane here is really great for applying very basic borders, but you actually have more options when you apply borders inside Perfect Effects. And I'll show you how to do that. So my recommendation is that when you're working on a black and white image and you'd like to add a border, just wait and reopen your photo in Perfect Effects later. It'll make more sense when we go in there. So just a little note about using Perfect Black and White. And then the last thing that I want to do before we leave Perfect Black and White is to save this as a preset. One of the reasons why we save as presets is partially because it helps save time. If we create a preset that we really love, which will open up, I have user presets right here, and you'll see that I have one called Liz's Classic Film Styles. And these are two presets that I created. There's one called a calotype preset that I made. It's one of my all-time favorites. I use it all the time. And then I have this very, very bright, glowy preset that I used for a series of images that I took of bridges. I call it Bridge Preset, which is why it has that name. And so I have this category of film style looks that I'd like to build up a little bit so that I can re-access them when I bring other photos in. And this preset here, we kind of went through and we changed a whole bunch of things like the toner, adding a vignette, adjusting the color response pane, and going through and having some fun with it. So up in the tool options bar, not the tool options bar, up in the menu bar at the top of your screen, there we go, open up the preset drop-down menu and choose Save Preset. From here, you'll want to give it a name. So I'll call this Stained Coffee. I can't spell coffee, film look. There we go. And then I'll place it in my Liz's Classic Film Styles category. If you don't have a category, just click on Add New Category to create one of your own. And then go ahead and click Create. It'll automatically pop up on the left-hand side. And you'll see I have a couple different categories in here. I have some called Custom Toners. These are toners that I've created that I want to be able to reuse. So if I click on any of these presets, it's going to eradicate what we did and it's going to replace it with whatever this preset was. But this gold teal toner that I created, I wanted to be able to save because I really liked the way that it looked. And then I also have some that I use for my personal projects here. And these are a couple that are still, most of them are old school film looks that I've created. Now, when you go through and you finish out in Perfect Black and White, there's the stained coffee look that we created. When we go ahead and click Apply, all of the changes that we made here in Perfect Black and White will be placed on one single layer on a PSD file. And what's great about that is if you do need to go back into your PSD and make adjustments, you can. Or if you want to go in and do things like add borders or textures, you can do that as well. Now, I want to go through and I want to show you kind of how to work with Perfect Effects to apply more of a color-based film style look. So we'll be talking about borders and textures a little bit, as well as some of the vintage stylings that you can add in Perfect Effects. So we'll talk a little bit about how to take an image like this one and add a border to it eventually. We're just going to jump in and use a slightly different photo for most of the other adjustments that we're going to make. Now, Perfect Effects is really great, and there are a lot of really wonderful things that you can do in the program. If you are creating a vintage look, I do recommend that you make your slight exposure adjustments. If you're working in a program like Lightroom, or aperture that you do a couple of basic adjustments so that you bring a photo in that's pretty well exposed before you're adding an antique look. It just helps the photo stand on its own first before you go in and add all of these crazy changes to it. So this image I lightened up a little bit and I took into Perfect Portrait to clean up some of the blemishes that were on the photo itself. And now it looks a lot better than it did straight out of camera. So any photo retouching or any basic changes that you need to make, you want to do before you add your vintage looks. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen, there is the filters library. These are all of the different filters that you can apply to an image. Now, we actually separated down 2 different filters here to kind of help navigate you a little bit more towards a vintage look. And what's great is they're very easy to find. There's the vintage one down at the bottom, and then up at the top, there is the antique filter. And they're a little bit different in how they work. The antique filter is based off of a single color that it applies to your image. So you'll see that there are options in here for, they're called auto-chrome presets. So there's auto-chrome cool, green, red, warm, and we can click on any of these. And on the right-hand side of the screen, the filter options pane will pop up. This is where you make adjustments to any of the filters that you apply to your photos. So we added the antique filter. These are all of the adjustments that we can make to that filter. Down at the bottom, there's a film grain section. This is where you can add film grain to your image to really give it more of an authentic look. It's up to you whether you like the grain or not. A lot of people work really hard to remove grain from their images, but if you want something to have a grittier, grungier style, adding a little bit of film grain can be a good thing. I'm going to go ahead and turn it off because I don't really want to add grain to my portrait image, so I'll just move the amount slider down to 0. And then up at the top, this is where you change the color that's being applied to your photo. Now, right now, it's set to Athens, which is this tealish green. It's a little bit of a bluish green. But when we open up the color drop-down menu, we can scroll through and we can choose a different color. And there are a ton in here. Now, as I mentioned before, these are single colors. So you'll see that the highlights and the shadows, they're these little tiny graphics about what the colors are next to the name of the city that they're based off of. But the gradients are all pretty monotone. So there's, for New York, for instance, there is a dark purple pink for the shadows, and then there is a light purple pink for the highlights. Now, when you find one that you really like, you can also go up and make changes to the brightness of the image, so how light or dark it is. So we could darken out the photo a little bit, which I really like for this image. You can add some haze. This adds a fogginess or a fade to the shadows in your image, so that if you have a photo that has very dark, very intense shadows, like he has really dark hair, very dark eyebrows, there's a little bit of darkness on the right-hand side. If I move the haze slider over to the right, it adds this faded look, which can be really nice. And then last is the saturation slider. This is the saturation of the underlying image, the original photo that we started out with, where all of those bright reds and oranges are from fall. The saturation slider only affects those colors. So if we move this over to the right, we can bring back some of the original color from our photo, but the Stockholm color, that bluish tone, is still being applied, as well as all the changes that we made in the brightness and haze sliders right up at the top. Or we can desaturate our photo to create more of a faded look itself. We'll pull away some of the original colors so it's a little bit softer, a little bit more desaturated, if you will. Now, the antique filter is, as you can see, pretty easy to use, and the vintage filter works in a very similar way. So we're going to go down and we're going to add one of these. The vintage filter is based off of 2 different colors. So instead of being one single color, right up at the top is something called the style drop-down menu. This is where you choose the color styling. And each one of these will have a different color for the highlights and the shadows. So this one has a blue for the highlights, a brown for the shadows. And there are many in here that you can go through and choose depending on which film look you're interested in evoking. Now, one of my favorites is called Oatmeal. And one of the reasons why I really like it is because it reminds me a lot of the negatives that my grandmother gave me from like the 60s and the 70s. They have that faded slide film look, which is really cool. And a lot of the photos that she had really hideous shag carpet, and they were all wearing very bright, beautiful dresses, and everything looks kind of soft focus and reddish orangish. And the oatmeal style is one of the best ways to get that look. The amount slider is just the intensity of the color that's added. So right now it's at 100, but if that's a little too intense, I can drop that down so it's a bit of a softer look. And then the saturation slider is just like the one in the antique filter. This is the saturation of the underlying photo. So we can either desaturate it to create a faded look, or we can keep it pretty highly saturated and you get a really vibrant look. I'm going to desaturate it just a tad so that it looks more like a faded film 1960s, 70s negative. When you're working on vintage images, most of the time, you're going to end up adding multiple different filters to create a look that you're going for. So I want this old film look. I want it to be kind of faded. I want it to look like one of the old slides that my grandmother gave me. So we added the vintage filter, but I also want to go in and add a texture and a border to kind of play a little bit more with that, maybe like a scratched negative, or I want to get a really cool border that evokes that old film look. So we're going to go over to the filter stack, and there is a plus button on the bottom left-hand corner. And when you click on it, it adds an empty filter layer here. So now I can add, for instance, a texture that I think will work on this image. So I'm going to go up, and there's a category on the left called the texturizer, which I've opened up. There are a ton of textures in here. There are a lot of different ways that you can go. My suggestion is right up at the top, there's something called Cool Concrete. This is a really good texture to start out with because once we click it, it's not going to be our final texture. But on the right-hand side, we can separate how we search for a texture and what we're looking for. There's the category menu in the filter options pane. So I could select, you'll see that we have photographic textures, which are really good, and paper textures, which are really good as well for a film look. The photographic textures are really nice because there are a whole bunch in here that have like a dirtiness or a grittiness that can be really fun. And once you select a category, you can open up the texture drop-down menu, and this is where you're going to find all of the different textures that relate to that category. So we have everything from scratched film, which can be really cool. There are a couple different in there that look like scratched film. There's something called roll end, which this is what it used to look like when you would end a roll of film. You would get this really weird cutoff point on the edge of your photo. And a couple of others in here that can be really fun to play around with. We also have light leaks in here if you want to add some sort of kind of accidental light leak to an image, which I'll show you how to do. Now, I'm going to start out and I'm going to apply a light leak, but I'm going to go down and choose this one called number 5, and we'll select it. Down below, the first thing that you want to change is the mode. This is how the leak is blending into your image. So there's normal, which is way too intense for me. There's subtle, which is still a little too intense for me. There's lighter, which is definitely going to be the one that I end up using. And there's darker, which is really not what we're looking for. So most of the time when you're working with light leaks, you're going to work with lighter because it will save your original image and then add this bright light leak on top. The other thing that's really important are the buttons down at the bottom. These are ways to rotate or flip your leak. So if I click the flip button, now I have the light leak on the top of the image, which is more of what I was going for. And then you can flip it or rotate it anyway. The other slider here is scale. So So this is how large that leak is. And what's really nice is if you have one like this that's got a really bright spot up in the top right-hand corner, by moving the scale slider over to the right, we can actually lose some of that brightness and we can tone down the intensity of the leak. Now in the middle, we have things like opacity. This is how strong you want it to be on your image. Most of the time, I keep the opacity down pretty low. I don't like a very strong, intense look. And then there's also hue, saturation, and brightness. So the brightness will change how light or dark the leak is. So if we make it a little bit darker, it kind of fades in a little bit better. Saturation is just the saturation of the light leak. So maybe we want it to be white, so it really looks like there was a light streak that came across the photo. If you want to maintain more of that reddish tone, you can keep the saturation up. And then hue gives you the ability to change the color just at all. So if you don't really like the yellowish orange, you can change the hue of the leak too. And this is a really, really easy way to change the look of your photo. Now, if you're not interested in light leaks, which you do not have to be, one of the other really fun textures to use are the scratched film textures. These are really good. You'll see that it really does look like somebody took the edge of like a razor blade and just scratched up against the edge of a piece of film. And this is really fun and it's really nice to add to an image. My suggestion is just like we did with the light leak, play around with the mode so that you can change how it's going to blend into your photo. Each one of these is going to look a little bit different. So you want to find the one that you think is going to work best for you. Subtle is generally the one I use for this. We'll go ahead and select that. And then I like to take my opacity slider and keep it really, really low. Not all the way to 0, but probably under about 20 or 30. And then down at the bottom, we'll change things like brightness. So we could lighten or darken this up a little bit. There's no saturation or hue with this texture, and then we can change the scale. So we could either make the scratches smaller, which I'll make this brighter so we can see it. You can either make your scratches smaller, or as we push this out, we can make them bigger and a little bit more separated from each other. So it's up to you which one's going to work best for your photo. We'll drop that opacity back down. Now, if you are working on a texture, one of the best things that you can do is go through and soften it on facial features. If you are working on images of people, a lot of times there will be a scratch across someone's face. You always have access to our masking brushes. Up in the top left-hand corner, you'll see I've got my masking brush selected. And you can go through and you can paint out a texture. Now, the way that I suggest doing this is up in your tool options bar, go up to the feathering amount and raise that all the way to 100, so you have a very soft-edged brush, and then lower your opacity down to about 20 or 30. When we do that, we're going to soften the texture that's been applied to someone's face, but we're not going to completely remove it. So now we can still see a little bit of the scratches that are there, but they're not as intense as the ones around the subject's faces. And we can go through and we can kind of soften some of these even more depending on how intense we want them to be. And there we go. Now, the last thing that we're going to add in here is a border. And I'll open up the borders pane on the left-hand side. And there are a ton in here. We're going to do something just like we did with the texture. We're going to click on the top option, which is called Border Defaults. And it's just a basic white border, which is really nice. On the right-hand side in the Filter Options pane, this is where we're going to choose the category and the border that will apply. The category drop-down menu here has a whole bunch of options. And the one that I typically go to is Film. There's also something called Camera, which can create these cool border edges that evoke movie cameras. So like 16mm cameras that people used to shoot with. People still shoot with them sometimes. So you'll get more of like a movie camera style look in the camera category. And there are a couple in here that also evoke old school viewfinders. And what's cool about some of these is that you get dust spots and little hairs and whatnot, which is a lot of times what would happen when you looked through a viewfinder. You would see all the dirt and grime that was on the back of the finder. And so these can be really fun to apply to. They do mostly add a texture along with them, so I suggest choosing whether you want to add a texturizer or whether you want to play around with one of the viewfinders that has that texture on it. Now I'm going to go up and I'm going to choose the film category here. So we'll go up and choose film. And then we'll open up the border drop-down menu and we will choose the type of film that we'd like to play around with. Now, there are a ton in here. We separate them down into the type of film. For instance, we have, scroll up here, there are different types of medium format film that have these really nice, very simple borders. There are 4x5 or large format film borders. These are one of the ones that I like to use a lot because I shoot 4x5 and it's always fun to make my newer images look like that. And we've got 35mm. We have instant film. So if you want to add more of an instant film style border, something that you would pull out of a Polaroid camera, these are really good, and so on. So there are a lot of different options for how these borders, which ones you're looking to apply. Platinum is going to be the one that we saw in black and white earlier. And so I'm actually going to use this just so that I can show you how useful the borders pane is here in Effects. So we'll select this border here. You have the options of changing all of your things like hue, saturation, and brightness. For most of the borders, they're either black or white, so that's not going to make much of a difference unless there's shading, and then you can change the brightness slider. Or some of these borders actually do have a color to them. So there are these dirty borders that you'll see that have kind of a leaked edge around the border inside. And a lot of these have a color base to them. So this one has almost a pinkish greenish look, and you can change the color. But most of them are not going to have any color to them. So the only thing you can really change is brightness. The most important sliders are going to be thickness and fit image. Now, the thickness slider, when I move this over to the right, will take the border and push it closer and closer to the edge of my photo. Now, if I wanted to, I could totally do this. Maybe I just want a little bit of brush on the bottom. I want a little bit of that like hole that you see on the top right-hand corner. It's slightly different than what we started with, but maybe I don't really want all those brush effects around the edges. That's not what I'm going for. Now, if you want to maintain the entirety of your border, but you'll see we're cutting off a whole bunch of our photo here. So if we look at our original image, we're cutting off a whole bunch of his hair and down at the bottom of her arms. And so the fit image slider takes your image and shrinks it down to fit inside the border itself. So we'll just kind of keep on going until we see that we're getting an overlap on the edge, which is usually pretty obvious. So we'll go down to 9, and that looks perfect. Now, we're not losing any of the edges. We may be losing a very minuscule amount, but that's what happens when you add a border. Not every border is going to fit perfectly with your photo, so you may lose a tiny bit of information, but not a lot. So just by playing around with fit image and thickness, you can save more of your photo or save more of your border. And these are options that don't exist inside Perfect Black and White. In black and white, you would have to cut out part of your photo, and that would be that. Whereas here, you can save the border and the photo all at the same time. So this is the reason why we take our final black and white images and bring them here into Perfect Effects to add a border. Now, I'm going to go through and I'm going to choose a different film border. And we have a whole bunch. I'm going to select this one called Film Type 52. And 52s were used in an old style of Polaroid back that you could use on photos or on old cameras. So I'm going to choose this option here. And I'm going to play around with my fit image and my thickness to make sure that I get all of my photo in there. So we're going to drop that down. And I can play around with the brightness here. So if I lighten or darken it, I like darkening it a little bit because I create that black edge, which looks really nice. But if you lighten it, you can get a really, really bright, almost white edge as well. And then the last thing here is you can also change how the border blends into your photo. And sometimes with ones like this, they blend very well. So if I go down and choose an option like soft light or overlay, you get kind of a weird grittiness in some parts, and that can be really useful. So it'll be up to you what you think works best. Normal is usually the option that I end up with, but every once in a while you'll have a border that looks cool when you blend it in. All right. Now, just like we did inside of Perfect Black and White, we want to save this as a preset. We want to be able to access the vintage layer, the texturizer, and the border pane adjustments that we made and reapply them to any image. So I'm going to go up to the preset menu and choose Save Preset. We'll call this Faded Type 55 Film Look. So that was the name of the border. It was the Film 55. I'll place it in a category. I have a special category called Liz's Film Presets, but if you don't have one, you can add your own. And we'll go ahead and click Create. And then we'll find it on the left-hand side in the Presets library underneath Liz's Film Presets. So I have a whole bunch in here that you'll see. We've got 1960s negatives, we've got colored sepia tones, we've got a whole bunch of cross-process looks, which are really popular. We've got cross-process looks with borders, and we have faded film looks. There's our Type 55 look, and so on. So these are all film styles that I've created. Most of them are ones that I use pretty regularly because a lot of the clients I work with want an old filmy look. So these are really, really popular, and I always have a lot of fun making them because film and vintage presets are the most fun to play around with. So always make sure that when you're done, you save a preset. It's really, really important because even if you only use a preset once or twice, it ends up being really useful.